Good evening. I am the ghost or spirit of P.K. Robbins, Prospect K. Robbins. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1782. In 1810, I moved from Massachusetts to St. Charles, Missouri. I fought in the War of 1812. I was a school teacher, and later, based on this, I was appointed county surveyor for St. Charles. In 1815, I received a letter from a gentleman by the name of William Rector. Seems like he had a little bit of survey work for me to do. So I went to his office, which was in St. Louis, and at that time met a gentleman by the name of Joseph C. Brown. Per the instructions of Mr. Rector, I was to run a north-south line. Mr. Brown was going to run an east-west line. And the instructions were for us to start in the fall of 1815. So in the fall of 1815, I met Mr. Brown on the bank of the Mississippi River. We had gathered our equipment, which was a compass and a chain. We gathered up our supplies. We hired our crew, which consisted of 2 chainmen, 2 axemen, compassmen, myself, and a cook. We headed south down the Mississippi River. We stopped at the St. Francis River. Mr. Brown made camp. We continued on down to the Arkansas River, where we made camp. Mr. Brown headed west. We headed north. 56 miles later, we intersected the 2 lines. We just established what's described as the initial point. That point is the basis of all the deeds in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, most of South Dakota, and North Dakota. At that point, at that initial point, it's described as I am establishing the 5th principal meridian. The 3rd and the 4th meridians are in Illinois. Per instructions, we were to measure, and every half mile, we were to set a post, mark witness trees. This is what we use to measure the half mile. This is a 2-pole chain, 33 feet. A true chain is 66 feet, has 100 links. When you get to the Missouri hills, it was difficult to keep a 66-foot chain level. So it was cut back to a 33-foot chain. Every half mile we would mark a post or set a post and mark witness trees. We reached the Missouri River, which was the end of our contract. It was over 317 miles later. When we finished, we left for St. Louis, turned over all my notes to Mr. Rector, and I went back to St. Charles. 1816, I married my wife, Elizabeth Evans. We had 2 children, Jesse and Charles. In the 1830s, Jesse and Charles moved here to St. Genevieve. Jesse was an attorney. He was circuit clerk and recorder for several years. He was also state rep. Charles was the county coroner for St. Genevieve County for quite a few years. Charles later moved up to St. Charles. I moved out here to Jesse. In May of 1847, I was baptized at the request of my wife. June 3rd, 1847, I died, and I was buried somewhere in this cemetery.
So I'll tell you my story. I'm a little bashful because he's filming, but I'll just jump into it. So my name is Marie Wren Julie Marie Barbeau. I was born in Prairie du Rocher into the Barbeau family, and I married John Baptiste Jenny, who was the son of the man who built the Green Tree Tavern, Nicholas Jenny.
Was Catherine your daughter?
Was who?
Catherine your daughter? Catherine Jenny married Etienne Boldu.
Oh, well, I'll have to look at my list. I know my siblings, but
Okay,
I haven't studied all my children.
Yeah.
I know one of our children, a son, was the 5 times great-grandfather of, the 4 times great-grandfather of Melissa Etheridge, and which makes me her
that's
5
right.
times
She was
great-grand.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. So So as I was saying, I was born into the Barbeau family in Prairie du Rocher. I had 5 sisters and 1 brother. My brother followed in our father's footsteps, and he became the captain of the militia in Prairie du Rocher and later a justice of the peace. Of my sisters, several of my siblings are speaking here this evening. One of my siblings is Ursule, who married Jean-Baptiste Vallée. Another one was Constance, who married Nicolas Jarreau, who was the builder of the Jarreau Mansion in Illinois. Another of my sisters was Suzanne. And of the 6 sisters, there were 3 of us named with the first name Marie. So I was Marie Wren. We had a Marie Jean. Marie Jean married Jean-Baptiste Vallée, and so they would have been the ones that built the Felix Vallée house, or well, that bought the Felix Vallée house for their son. And so the 3rd Marie in our family, so we had Marie Wren, Marie Jean, and Marie Louise. So my husband and I got married in 1781. I was 17 and he was 22. We had 9 children together. I died when I was 51 and my youngest child was 5 years old. He lived until he was 78, and so he saw all of our children grow into adulthood. At the time that we married, we got married in Prairie du Rocher, and we moved to Kaskaskia. We lived in Kaskaskia for about 14 years, and then we moved here to St. Genevieve. So at the time that I died in 1835, I was buried here in this cemetery. We don't know where my grave was, so I'm here by this grave, which was, people that died in the early 1800s. But I'm here someplace in this graveyard. So.
Well, your daughter that married Etienne,
yes,
they had 3 children, and her and the granddaughter, her daughter married René Lamière.
Oh, how about that?
And then René and his wife died by 1826, and your daughter Catherine lived in that Lamière house and raised their 3 children until 1837.
Okay, so we were very close.
All that, yeah, because it was right down. Yeah, isn't that neat?
Right.
Oh, how exciting to meet you.
Well, nice to meet you.
Miss Johnny. Madame Johnny.
Madame Johnny.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. A great story, and it connects to what I do.
Right.
Yeah.
I have the list of my children. So what is the first name of the
Catherine.
one? Catherine. So I'll have
With
to
a
look
C,
that
just
list
like
up.
mine. Catherine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this
How
is
about
so
that?
fun. Yes. It's our anniversary. So we're celebrating here.
Great. The lively dead.
Whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm Barbara Okenfoos. I am here visiting 4 of my little babies who are buried here, but I'm not sure exactly where because their grave markers have rotted away. Most people had just wooden crosses, and there were over 5,000 people buried in this cemetery, they think, at one time. Anyway, I came from Germany. My parents brought me over here when I was young, back in 1843. I met my husband here. His great uncle paid his passage over here. Together we had 11 children, 4 of which are buried in this cemetery. And the boys became prominent citizens here in town. One was a tinsmith who put those red and silver tin roofs on the buildings downtown. Another was a carpenter who made coffins to bury people in the cemetery. I outlived 7 of my 11 children. I lived to be over 90 years old, and I am buried on the other side of town in the newer cemetery because by that time this cemetery was full and had been closed. The reason many Germans came over here is because a man named Duden wrote a book about when he lived here in Missouri. He described it as the perfect place to live, that the rolling hills would remind you of Germany and home. There's a river nearby. It's just the perfect place to come. And he also said, don't go too far north to settle because it gets too cold in the winter. And don't settle too far south because it gets too hot in the summer. He just didn't happen to mention we get both here. And thousands of Germans came over. Many stopped here in St. Genevieve and others went on further, St. Louis, Herman. That's how I ended up here. You know, St. Genevieve was founded by the French, but the Germans came in about 100 years later and outnumbered them. It changed the way things work, the way of life for the people in St. Genevieve.
I am John Henderson. I'm one of the 2 Scots that are buried here in the cemetery. We don't know a lot about my early life, but we do know that the Scots were recruited to help fight with the Indian rebellions around the Pennsylvania area. Now, I probably came at that point in time. I wasn't much of a fighter though. I was more interested in being a shopkeeper. So after the fighting ended, I actually worked my way across to Missouri, found my way to St. Genevieve. My intention was to open a shop and become a shopkeeper, meet a nice girl, settle down, and raise a family. Unfortunately, at the age of 38, I succumbed to the cholera epidemic that was going on at that time. So I died in October of 1841. Now the inscription on my grave says, "Sweet, sweet, be the sleep in the bosom of earth, in the grave far away from the home of thy birth. Thou hast finished the race, thou hast reached the far goal. Peace, peace to thine ashes, and rest to thy soul." From this vantage point, it looks like the stone has a flat top, but if you step back, you can actually see that it's an obelisk, and the point is still there. It's been there since 1841. The stone was actually donated by my brothers, Gordon and Charles. Erected by Gordon and Charles Henderson, brothers to the deceased, as a slight testimonial of their affection for the departed. They were from Aberdeenshire, Scotland.
Hey, you all?
Good.
Great. Welcome. It's good to be awake again. Gee, what a beautiful day they gave us.
Yes.
Somebody up there likes us. I'm Senator Lewis Lynn. I was born in November of 1795, actually November 5th, the day before our good elections, and almost my birthday today. So thank you all for coming and helping me celebrate.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I was born near Louisville, Kentucky, and my parents were pioneers. My dad actually was captured by the Shawnees and held captive for 3 years before he escaped. And I started my schooling, or my college education, in Louisville, and I was studying medicine. But when the Second War of Independence broke out, I became, do you know what the Second War of Independence is?
No.
We call it, you call it now the War of 1812. Remember we were kind of in a little battle with the same folks the second time? They didn't realize that they had lost in the 1770s. And so, anyway, make a long story short, I became a surgeon in Dodge's troops, and then when the war was over, I stayed on in Philadelphia and graduated in 1860 and was admitted to practice medicine in St. Genevieve in the territory of Missouri. As I mentioned, I did the math, 21 years old and I'm a doctor.
Wow.
Today, 21 years old, you're just starting med school.
Yeah.
So I moved out here and met the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, Elizabeth Ruff. We were married in 1818. And one of my interests, or a major interest of mine, was cholera. And, you know, it was rather prevalent. And I corresponded with doctors and read a lot. I corresponded with doctors in Europe and became somewhat of an expert in its treatment. And enjoyed medicine very much, but people kept bugging me, if you will, to run for political office, and I finally succumbed in 1827, became a commissioner here in the city of St. Genevieve, and things were going along okay. In 1830, I was appointed to the French-Spanish Land Commission to try and help settle claims about who owned what. And that was going along fine. Elizabeth and I and the two kids moved to St. Louis. And in 1833, on the death of Senator Buckner, who was in the U.S. Senate from Missouri, I was appointed by the governor to fill out his term, and then was reelected in both 1836 and 1842. While in the Senate, one of my big interests was westward expansion, in particular getting the Oregon territories before the British did. I sponsored a bill for westward expansion, and it passed the Senate, but just failed in the House by a slim majority vote. So, a couple years later, the senior senator from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, and I sponsored another bill, the Land Donation Act, which would give 640 acres of land to settlers to encourage them to come to Oregon. And it was passed in 1850, which was after my death, but it did encourage. And as you go west, you'll find Lynn, I think there's Lynn County, Lynn, Missouri. They're all named after me because of my work in encouraging westward expansion. Well, there were two major cholera epidemics here in St. Genevieve. One in 1833, which I came down and helped out, and actually caught cholera myself, but survived it, or got cholera. It's not contagious. And in 1842, when it broke out, or 42, I came back from Washington to help out, and while here I had an aneurysm and passed away. And then I was buried here. This is my monument. And in 1861, Elizabeth passed away, and this is her monument. Well, one of the things I'm most proud of during my political career is that I became known as the model senator from Missouri. And this was because I was able to work on both sides of the aisle, and people respected me. And man of my word, if I said something, I never back down from it. And so I could be trusted, and this is how I got to be known as a model senator. Well, Elizabeth and I are sitting here. As a senator, you travel quite a bit, and you get a little tired of that. Well, after Elizabeth joined me, we had to be kind of happy because it's a pretty good view here. Yeah. And that was nice. Well, around 1880, this cemetery was closed because it was full. And they had a new cemetery over on the other side of town, which is still in use. So Elizabeth and I are here, and after 1880, it wasn't being tended and was kind of run over, and the state was concerned that their model senator was going to be in an abandoned cemetery, and decided we got to change that. And so here we go, moving again. Picked us up, monuments and all, and took us over to the new cemetery. Well, we got settled there, and it was comfortable, nice view.
It was comfortable.
And everything was going fine. Well, in the mid-30s, the city fathers realized they had a very historic cemetery here. It's one of the old, I think it might even be the oldest cemetery west of the Mississippi or something like that, or one of the older, certainly. And they cleaned it up, did a beautiful job. And in 1936, they're sitting around and saying, you know what? Senator Lynn doesn't belong there. He and Elizabeth belong here. Well, okay, we're going to travel again. So they dig us up. And when they dug up my coffin, I'm in an airtight iron coffin. And there was a glass faceplate, but it was covered by an iron cover. Well, the hinges on the cover had kind of corroded a bit. and the cover tended to fall off, and the coroner opened it, Leo Bogler, and you could see me, and I'm perfectly preserved. The skin on my face is taut. You can see my goatee, my eyebrows, my hair.
Oh my God.
Well, word spread around town, and by the time Elizabeth and I got here, there was a crowd. They all wanted to see this. Okay, first time I ever told a story, there was a lady that lives not far from here, just across from the church, and she stopped me right there, and she said, "John, I was in kindergarten at the time,
Oh wow.
and they let us out of school." She said, "I came up, and I saw you." And then she paused and says, "And I didn't sleep well that night."
So what year was that?
1936.
Wow.
This is a picture, excuse me, of the coffin, and you can see the styles of the ladies in 1936.
Oh, wow.
We men are still in the same stuff. We haven't changed since 36.
What a neat picture.
And this is me.
Oh wow.
You all can pass it around if you want to look at it.
Oh yeah? Can we pass it around? Wow. Really is.
So, we thank you all for coming up. It's good to get up once a year. Enjoy you all. Hope you enjoy the cemetery. We're still in the process of restoring it.
Really?
Yeah.
What year did you say you died?
Beg pardon?
What year did you die?
1842.
Okay.
And we started, I forget how many years ago, cleaning up the cemetery and took down an old fence that was around from probably 1930s and spent about $300,000 on fixing up some of these. Someplace
Cost that much, really?
there are pictures of these headstones before and after.
Well, I was telling her I thought they had to have done something with them.
Oh yeah.
There's no way they could preserve them that well.
They're not all done, and we're doing about, I think Jack told me, my Scottish friend over here, that we're doing about 10 a year.
Wow. 10 a year. Wow. Well, good for you. It's very cool. Good for you. Well, I really.
Okay, so thank you for coming, and thank you for wanting to hear about my family. So I am Marie Villers, and I was born May 20 of 1790, and I died May the 3rd of 1846. So I lived in town for 56 years. My mother was Marie Louise Valley, and her father was Francis Valley. He was captain of the militia in the old town of St. Genevieve. My father was Louis de Bril de Villers, and he was also commandant of the militia in the old town of St. Genevieve. So my family had a military presence. I had one brother and 3 sisters, and they all married very well. I was very proud of them. My brother Joseph married Eleonora St. John Beauvais. She was the niece of Vital St. John Beauvais. And you're going to hear these names over and over as you come around the cemetery. We're all related in one way or another. Vital was a wealthy merchant, and he did a lot of business both in Kaskaskia and St. Genevieve. Of my 3 sisters, Marie Mathilda, she was the oldest, and she married Philip Francis Camille de Halt de Lazarus. His father was Pierre Charles de Halt de Lazarus de Louisière. He was captain of the militia in the town of Nouvelle Bourbon. My sister Euphrosyne, and we like to call her Eugenia, she married John Price. John was a very wealthy Kentuckian who came here around 1800, and he built the old brick tavern. And my 3rd sister, Marceline, she was the oldest, and she did best of all. She married Joseph Herditch. Joseph is right behind you there. He came here in 1810 from Switzerland, an educator, extremely wealthy. His first order of business was to build a school, and he built the School of the Asylum, a very large building. It was built on the River Oxboss Creek, and he taught in the Pestalozzi method, meaning that he felt children should learn not only out of books but from nature, and he was known for taking the children on walks, nature walks. He was very, very popular. He was chosen to be the first warden of the first Masonic Lodge west of the Mississippi. It was called the Louisiana 109. Meetings were held in the Janice Ziegler Green Tree Tavern. And because of his education and because he started a school, in 1833 Governor Dunklin appointed him to lead a commission to start the first public school system in the state of Missouri. It's fascinating, huh? Yeah. So that's my family. Questions? Anybody? No?
So
Any
the
questions about
steamboat explosion? How many fatalities were there?
You know, hundreds. We don't know for
And they're
sure.
buried in that, like
In
the draw right there?
Yes, that mass grave. Yeah.
Now we heard
so-
that there was a mass grave of Indians as well. It was on one of your write-ups, I think.
And that I don't know.
Okay.
You know, I wouldn't speak to something I haven't researched personally. We're tasked to research each person, and you know, I don't know that aspect, but hey, could happen.
Very good. I
Yeah,
like it.
yeah.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So this is your family,
This is my family.
and are people still able to be buried here?
I think the answer is no,
Okay.
and I can't speak to exactly why. I think the cemetery was started in, I think, 1787.
it
Yeah.
says, yeah.
Mhm.
So,
And I don't know when the last person was buried.
but this is your family,
This is my family.
historical family.
Historical family, yes, sir. And at one point, they did move some of the graves around, and they exhumed some people and moved them
really?
out. Not sure why, but when they replaced people, what happened was some of the cornices of the tombstones got switched, and I wound up with my brother-in-law's cornice, so I got the better deal.
My gosh.
Yes, I did.
I don't know what that means.
This is a cornice.
Right,
So
but you
this-
said you wound up with your,
Well, my brother-in-law's buried there.
yes.
He had this one, and I had that one. And when they redid it, I wound up with his.
You don't know the reason why they redid it? What year did they
So-
redo it?
I don't know. I don't know. I just know that they did.
Yeah,
So
that's
you
very
are-
unusual, isn't
You
it?
are returned from the dead? You said this is yours. I don't understand.
Yeah.
I don't understand when you said this one was yours.
Well, that cornice was on this tombstone, and when they switched,
They redid
they redid
the
them,
cemetery,
No,
Jane.
I
They switched them.
misunderstood
Yeah.
when you said that I wound up with.
Yeah,
His.
his.
Who is the I?
She's buried here. She.
I is Marie Villers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I thought I meaning you.
No, not Mimi.
That's I didn't know.
Start over
Okay.
again. I'm sorry.
My name is Pelage Benavou Janis. I was born in 1767 on the Isle of Kaskaskia. My father was Antoine and my mother was Marie Louise. We had a good life on Kaskaskia. There was another family on Kaskaskia, Nicholas and Marie Louise Janis, and they had a son, Francois. I liked Francois. So we fell in love and we were married on the Isle of Kaskaskia. We had a good life there. My mother and father-in-law moved over here to St. Genevieve, and they built a Port du Soleil, I say that wrong most of the time, house. It's a vertical log house that sits on the ground, and it is the oldest house standing in Missouri. It is the Green Tree Tavern, which has recently become under the Parks, National Parks Registry. Nicholas and Marie Louise ran the tavern until she passed away. So Francois and I moved over to help him run the tavern. Francois and I had 11 children. Our daughter Marie Louise married J.B. Valley Jr., but she had a weak heart and she didn't live long. She had a good marriage though, and after she passed away, my daughter Pelage, named after me, she married J.B. Valley Jr. and continued to raise the children that her sister had had, and they had a good life. My son Antoine married into the Beauvais family, and they have a house on Merchant Street. You know, the Green Tree Tavern was the first Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi. It was Louisiana number 109. We had a traveler come through. His name was Ash. He was a writer, and he was told he had to stay at the Green Tree. So when he stayed there, he wrote later when he left that Francois was a lively Frenchman and that my coffee rivaled any that he had had in France. And that made me feel really, really good. Of course, we inherited the inn when my father-in-law passed away. Francois became the overseer of the big field, which was an important job because it helped produce the food for the area. When I was 63, I was tired and I passed away and come here to join my daughter and my other family members, and Francois followed me a month later. He could not live without me, so we have eternity here together. I don't have a stone. It has become lost in time, but I know my family is here, so this is where I stay. The Green Tree Tavern, I've heard, is going through lots of renovations now, and it has got a cat living in it, and the cat's name is Nicholas, and it's a black cat. So somebody's living in my home again, and that makes me feel good. And that is my story.
Louisiana Purchase in 1804.
Je suis la commandante, la dernière commandante
Lewis and Clark
de la
departed in
poste de
1804.
Saint-Geneviève.
So, but
Avez-vous visité
I was
le
born here in
village
St.
aujourd'hui?
Genevieve.
You live here in the village?
Mr. Pratt.
C'est bon?
My parents were
C'est
in
bon?
the mercantile business, and they were also led my
Did you
business.
like this?
Yeah.
Très bien.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's spooky.
And when I was
Yeah, it's
18, I
spooky.
married
I like it. It's
the
cool.
gentleman that's buried here
Yeah.
with me, Felix
Last year,
Ballet.
a girl caught on fire.
He was
Now, do you say
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Down there.
you all share
Yeah, a
the
girl
same
caught on fire.
well,
I know.
buried in the
Yeah.
he's buried.
Yeah.
But not all by herself. She had help from a
And,
candle.
Right. Yeah.
Felix
Can you
was
speak
a very
English?
wealthy, prominent citizen of
un
the
peu.
St. Genevieve at the time.
Un peu.
And the school ballet, the ballet school was named after Felix. And when I was,
Avez-vous
we
vu
had one son,
ma maison?
Louis
Ma
Felix.
maison? Maison?
Unfortunately, he died at the age
La
of
maison?
83, and he
Maison?
was
Maison? Maison? Oui, d'accord. Avez-vous vu ma maison? C'est exactement. C'est une grande maison. Et je suis très importante.
Very important. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactement. Exactement. So, vous habitez à Saint-Geneviève?
It's a state historic site.
Vous habitez ici?
And
Ah oui, je...
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't translate that much French.
Vous habitez à Saint-Geneviève, au Saint-Louis, à Festus, Perryville.
So he was a very prominent man.
Votre
He
maison.
was interested in dealing with the Indians. and
Your house?
My house.
Où est
that was
votre
his
maison?
connection to-
I don't know.
Where's your house?
Where's my house? In Rolla.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. D'accord.
Felix
bon.
lived in our house for 50 years, and I lived there for 7 years.
Vous avec sa famille
No, after
ici?
Pierre Menard died, shortly
Son
after his
père?
Yeah, I live with him and with her.
Très bien, très bien.
That's my mom and that's my
Felix
grandpa.
decided to close the mercantile
Son
store
grand-père
and
et sa mère.
Yeah, mom and grandpa.
Très bien,
So
très bien.
Felix lived in the house for 50 years, and I lived there for 7. So when I passed over, Felix
Vous
died
parlez
just
français?
20 years
Yeah,
before
now I
me.
know some French.
Ah, exactement. C'est bon.
Yeah.
C'est bon.
I'll probably forget it in like 2 minutes, but
Non.
yeah.
Répétez, 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 répétez. Oui. Now, les numéros. J'ai 89 ans. Voilà. 89.
89.
Oui. Je suis... Oh, vieux. Je suis vieux. Très vieux. Et c'est ma femme, Jean. C'est moi, Jean-Baptiste Vallet. C'est ma femme, Jean.
Your wife?
All right.
This is the second time that
Je suis ensemble ici. Ensemble,
And family?
non?
No.
Ensemble.
it all
It
basically
all
started
began
here.
here. Yes, this is a centuries old.
Speaking ensemble.
And the cemetery
Yeah,
is
exactement.
centuries old.
Ici. Ici. Ensemble.
Assemble.
Together.
Together. Oh.
Ah.
That makes
We
sense.
have burials from
D'accord.
the latter part of the 1700s.
Okay.
Ensemble. Ensemble.
probably a lot of them because Felix was a
Kind of
very
spoke
good
Spanish, we could converse.
Not
Espanol. We're kind of stupid when it comes to stuff.
No.
I do a little bit of Spanish.
I gave 3/4 of the money that it took to build this picture.
No?
I passed 2 years.
2 years. He's my father.
Espagnol et français
Some similarities.
Oui.
And then I always heard that Portuguese is kind of in between Spanish and French. Like some similarities.
Who married Felix Valet, his youngest son. And I was born in 1804 here in St. Genevieve. My maiden name was Duprat, and when I was 18, I married Felix Valet, Jean-Baptiste's youngest son. Felix was a prominent, wealthy man at that time, and a year later we had a son named Louis, and Louis lived to be 33 and died as a relatively young man, but unfortunately he never married. So we had no direct heirs, we had no grandchildren. We had lots of nieces and nephews, but no grandkids. So, when our child was just a few months old, we purchased a house just down the street here on Merchant Street, a couple blocks down. And we opened a business, and we opened a mercantile store in that house. So it was divided, half was a mercantile store and half was our residence. The mercantile store was known as Menard and Valet Trading Firm. Our partner was Pierre Menard from across the river in Fort Kaskaskia. And we ran a business there until 1843 when Pierre Menard died, and we decided to close the store and remodel our house to be strictly a residence after that time. So Felix lived in our house for about 50 years, and I lived in the house for 70. I was almost 90 years old when I passed away. Felix was buried here in the cemetery 20 years before me, and they unfortunately closed the cemetery. They said that the cemetery was full, and the city said it was a health hazard, and no more burials were to be had here. So I wanted to be buried next to Felix, so I made the city an offer they couldn't refuse. I offered them a tract of land on the outskirts of town if they would allow me to be buried here in the cemetery, and they agreed. So I was the last burial here in the cemetery. Nice. It's okay, we can come, but I just don't want you to fall.
Oh. I fallen once today, so I'll be fine. I tripped over a tent over in
I
earlier.
tripped on a molehill when coming up here.